Okay, we are live. I am hoping that the audio quality of this is okay. I've been having some issues with my sound. All right, so let's talk. My name is Saar, and I would like to explain why I'm going to be making this episode briefly. So, there are things you learn as you become an adult in your mid to late 20s, or perhaps later, we're all children at heart, that you probably wish you had heard earlier in your life, say in high school or even middle school, about communication and relationships. Communication and relationships are a lot of what gives people sort of meaning and purpose, and it's a lot of what we care about. And most of the things we do in life are to improve those things, whether we realize them or not. So, yeah. Let's get started. I'm going to be talking about these in no particular order. These are ideas that my partner and I have come across or heard and refined or talked about extensively. Some of these may be familiar to you. Some of these may be completely new. But these are all things that we agreed we wish we had been told much earlier on in the process of forming relationships, whether they're intimate or friendship relationships or employer-employee relationships. It doesn't really matter. Having solid communication makes these things better, and these are some guidelines which we found very useful for communicating better. So let's get started. The first can be summarized as ignorance before evil, and what that means is let's break down what that actually means. Assume that your partner, I'm going to be talking a lot about these rules in terms of partner relationships, but this really can be anybody. This can be your business partner, this can be a friend. Assume that they're being ignorant before they are being evil, meaning that they're not doing something bad to you because they're trying to deliberately be doing something bad to you. They're doing something bad to you because they don't know something you know that they need to know. And as with a lot of these, if some of these guidelines come up that are sort of more oriented at the intentions of the person you're communicating with, if you can't assume that your partner is just being ignorant and you think they have bad intentions for you, you need to ask yourself, or you should consider asking yourself, why you're with them in the first place. And if a person doesn't fit the bill for that, then maybe they don't necessarily fit the bill for being in a relationship with you. It doesn't mean you can't maintain any relationships with people that you think are bad for you, but do you really want that to be your partner or your business partner even? So, ignorance before evil. And what that looks like is, say you like things organized a particular way and your partner doesn't know, well, if they don't know that, then, and you know that, then that means we're in the same boat. But let's say you just moved in together and you like to keep something in a certain place, your partner uses it and they don't put it back. Chances are they just don't know you want it there. It actually is a safer assumption in terms of sort of human life and statistics to assume that people just don't know that you have a certain preference unless you've made it very clear. And even then, they're going to forget because it's not their preference. And people don't even always keep very good track of their own preferences. So that one applies. But it can even be something sort of rougher. Let's say you're at an event and your partner says something you feel like insulted you. If chances are they don't know. And chances are they didn't know that they just stepped on your foot, or, you know, any kind of variation thereof. So always assume ignorance before assuming evil is kind of a good rule of thumb. That leads us into our second one, which we summarized as, your partner isn't telepathic and neither are you. This one is a little bit different, but it is similar. It doesn't involve any assumptions about the other person, but you shouldn't assume that you know what your partner is thinking in all cases. So let's say, for example, you want to take your partner out, or you want to take a date out. Let's start with that. And you want to take them someplace that they'll enjoy, it really doesn't make sense for you to try to read in too much to their preferences based on the brief information, the brief, short little bits of information people gather about one another before they really get to know each other. You're about to take somebody out on a coffee date. You want to take them someplace they like, or a dinner date, let's say, because coffee's the same basically everywhere. And you've looked at their Facebook, and based on that, you start to arrive at all kinds of conclusions. You're not Sherlock Holmes, and you're not Professor X, and you can't read minds. And it makes a lot more sense and creates a lot less friction for you to just ask the person if they have a certain preference about where you go. You know, are you a vegetarian? You don't know if they're a vegetarian, ask them. And the reverse also applies. If you have a special preference or a need or a want or something like that, you can't assume your partner's going to know unless you make it pretty clear verbally. And that's scarier than just hoping someone will figure you out. But no one's going to get you if you don't explain yourself. And I think we have been sold to a great extent this image of you're going to find people who get you. Whether this is friends or business partners or intimate partners, it doesn't matter. It's kind of your job to explain your wants and needs, your preferences, your agenda, whatever it is, and make sure that that's been clearly communicated to the people around you where it matters. It doesn't make sense for somebody else to kind of have a perfect window into your mind. It's not that simple. The next one is that you should sort of talk about everything by default. And talking about everything by default actually is a very scary concept because there are a lot of things like sex, money, religion, political stances in some cases that people really don't want to talk about. And they would rather just kind of curl up on the couch with you or whatever. But the reality is that these things are very, very important to talk about. Because if it's not a concern now, it's going to be a concern later, especially in intimate relationships, but even in some cases in business partnerships. And you may not necessarily need to talk about politics in those cases, but you might find that these things drive a lot of your decision making further down the line. And if you don't talk about things early on, they can kind of boil over. And this gets into another thing which we've observed, which is it's always better to talk about an issue as it comes up as opposed to sitting on it for very long. Now, this doesn't mean that if you're at a dinner party and something goes wrong, you want to necessarily pull your partner aside and immediately have a discussion about it. But you definitely don't want to sit on it until 3 days later when you've kind of gone through these cycles in your head of, well, what did they mean to hurt me or anything like that. Just talk about it straight up and let the person know, you know, this bothers me or this happened and I wanted to discuss it with you or this is something I'd like to try. The longer you sit on things, the more distorted they become in your own head. And there's a very real possibility your partner will just forget that they did it. People don't keep track of wrongdoings that they don't know they did. So that's another one that we've observed. And this is sort of a guideline for how to talk to people. And there are two that we've come up with or found to be useful. One is borrowed from debate and debating tactics, which is steel manning your interlocutor. So if you know what steel manning is, just to summarize, steel manning is when you try to express your interlocutor's position in the best way possible. And this is something that is a great habit to get into when you're talking to anybody about anything. If I'm going to sit down with my partner and talk about something, I want to make sure I've got her position clear before I start stating my own or what I'd like to change about how we're doing things. And this is really important. You can't hope to be understood unless you understand where the other person is looking at you from. So it's important to get other people's perspective, and the best way to make sure you've gotten their perspective is to restate it. So it's not that you should view your partner as an interlocutor or an opponent in a debate, but it is a tactic which we sort of got from her background in debate and other sources. The other thing is referring to problems in terms of your own feelings. So if something goes wrong, rather than stating, you hurt me, it's I feel hurt, because at least that way you're talking about somebody who, and this is an extension of the whole thing about not being telepathic, you have access to your mind and your mind alone. You might get better at reading your partner with time, but you still should say, I feel like you're angry, if their nonverbals, their body language has shifted in that direction, as opposed to talking about how angry you think they are without, they might not be angry. They might just have screwed their face up for some other reason. You might be reading into their facial expression. And it's hard to do this one because as human beings, we're kind of, for those of us who don't have any issues reading facial expression, sometimes they're really obvious, and sometimes it seems like it's just, that's what it is. But they could be angry at someone else or thinking about something else that makes them mad, and that's why they're making that face. And it's not at you. So you got to talk about it. As you can see, these rules all kind of tie into each other. The next one is avoid making your shit someone else's. I am going to be cursing a lot on this podcast. I don't really feel like restricting language is particularly useful. So if that offends you, I'm sorry. Avoid making your shit someone else's. Avoid making your problem someone else's. So if you have a problem, and unless it's with your partner, there's no reason to necessarily hand them that issue to solve, and try to solve your problems on your own. It doesn't mean you shouldn't ask for help, and there's a bit of a dichotomy there, because asking for help is important. And if your partner is particularly good at something and you're under a time crunch and you need it done, so let's say I'm good at imaging and my partner needs that done for an article she's writing or something like that, and I can come up with a visualization quickly, then it might not make sense for me to do that by myself. But if we're talking about most things, there's a lot of things in life people can solve by themselves, and they either won't ask for help when they really do need it, or never ask for help. So a question to kind of ask yourself, a little prompt, is this something my partner can solve with no effort that I'm going to break my head over for the next hour? That's to check if you're the type of person that really has trouble asking for help. And the other one, the sort of reverse, the flip side for that one is, am I asking for help because I'm being lazy, or am I asking for help because I really don't feel like dealing with this? Or am I asking for help because I genuinely cannot solve this problem by myself? And there's nothing wrong with asking for help when you can't solve a problem, but making your partner solve all of your issues for you is something that both of us, meaning me and my partner, had seen at various points in other relationships that people did either to us or we did to other people, and it's something you want to avoid. And sort of striking that balance can be difficult, and we might get into that more in depth later in this podcast about how to decide when something is worth solving by yourself. Be liberal with your compliments and tight-fisted with your criticism. This one is great. This is a useful trick you can do. This applies to parents to their kids. This applies to kids to their parents. Criticism should only be leveled at somebody if you have any kind of a helpful suggestion about what to do differently. And in general, people don't feel like they get complimented when they do well, and a lot of people feel underappreciated. I think that's something everyone has felt at some point in their life. If somebody does something good, point it out. Just point it out to them. You could make their day. You have no idea. They might have been having a really terrible week, and that might just solve it for you right there. And criticism, again, only level it, and level it carefully if you've got some kind of a helpful suggestion. If somebody, I don't know, paints something and you think the painting is garbage, but you have nothing helpful to say about how to improve, maybe keep it to yourself. I'm not saying you got to walk around being fake and smiling at things that you don't think are good, but you don't have to speak your mind every single time. And I think that is a rule that sort of, as kids, we're sort of told to suppress what we think a lot by the adults around us. As we get older, we realize we have a way, we can talk, we have a right to talk, and we start just, blasting off our opinion at everybody at every given opportunity. And then you kind of come back to some kind of a reasonable middle ground as you get older, when you realize that your opinion doesn't matter every time. And so that's sort of an extension of that sort of thinking. Avoiding absolutes is a really good one. So this is a rule which applies whenever you're having a discussion, and especially if you're having a discussion about something people frequently disagree on, like religion. If you are talking in absolutes, you need to be absolutely sure. So if somebody asks me, for example, where's my wallet? Well, it should be in such and such a place. I'm not even going to talk about that absolutely, because everybody puts things down somewhere that's not supposed to be. And very few things in life, if you're a reasonable person, are you going to be 100% certain on. Talking about things in terms of a confidence interval is a very, very useful way to keep conversations from boiling over if they're about a difficult topic. And even if it's not a difficult topic, there's no reason for you to express more certainty than you actually have. And I think that a lot of people do this in order to look confident. But you can actually appear more confident if you are willing to show where your thinking isn't solidified. And walking around just like, yeah, I'm certain of every single opinion I have is ridiculous. Because even if you've got training in a subject, and actually, especially if you have training in a given subject, you'll probably find that you're less certain about things as you learn more information. And the more information you acquire and the older you get, the less certain you are of how things are going to come out. So avoiding absolutes is a very useful habit to develop, and learning to talk in terms of, well, I'm about 80% confident in the following, or I'm 60% confident in the following. I like to frame things in terms of bets I would make. So if I'm very confident about something, I might say, I'd bet my hand, or I'd be willing to risk my hand on that. That's a really good way to frame things, you know, if I wanted to express near certainty. But I wouldn't say I'd bet my life on it, for example, right? Because there are very few things you're going to gamble that one on. And you can also talk about, like, you know, in terms of money amounts, that's something that sometimes people really get. So you'd say, I'd be willing to bet $30 that such and such is true, as opposed to 200 or 1,000 or my next month's rent, something along those lines. It can be a kind of a fun way to make it clear how much you believe in something. This is one that my partner pointed out to me, which I really think we both try to do, and this is a useful one to do, which is that you should if you perceive that your partner is hurt or you've done some wrong to them, just apologize. Apologize first and worry about the right and wrong of it later. The point in your relationship should not be to prove that you're right about things. It's fine to debate things with your partner if you that's a type of communication you guys sort of square with, that's fine. But in most cases and with most relationships, being right isn't necessarily the point. Keeping the relationship positive and constructive is a lot more important. If someone's really dug in, or they're hurt about something, or they're dug in on a position, it doesn't really make sense to worry about if you were right before you apologize for hurting somebody. It doesn't cost you anything other than a little bit to your ego. And there's a dichotomy here, because you can look at this the other way. Sometimes people are over apologetic, and you don't have to apologize for everything. But in a lot of cases, I think people kind of have a tendency to trample on stuff that the other person doesn't perceive as, the other person perceives it as costly or dear to them, and it might not be to you. And that's where sort of another idea we talk about a lot, which is kind of the 90-10 stretch rule, which is if something is 10% effort for me and 90% effort for my partner, I'm going to do it. And if it's 10% effort for them and 90% effort for me, they're probably going to end up doing it. And this becomes important when you live together. You kind of realize who's good at what, and you divvy up work based on that. And that's a useful thing to talk about. So I think that covers most of the kind of language rules that we've been playing around with and refining over the last 4 years of our relationship. These are things I wish I had heard a long time ago and put out pretty clearly. There are some more things that are kind of obvious, which is that content, context, and tone matter. So you can say the same phrase with different tones of voice in different situations, and they'll mean something completely different. So, come over here, for example, said neutrally, could be fine. But if you say something like, come over here, and you got some candles lit, that means something completely different. And you can also yell, come over here, at somebody, and you make a face, and it's pretty clear that you're pissed off. And you always need to keep that in mind. And there are people who I've met who are pretty toxic in terms of how they communicate with other people, where they make sure, this is something I call lawyering. They keep their language very clean, but their tone is really bitchy. It's underhanded. It's not a nice, friendly anything, and they'll be just like, oh, that's fine. You can almost hear it in the consonants that it's not fine. But they'll tell you afterwards, what? I said it was fine. And so you end up in this sort of catch-22 situation where you can't criticize what they said because the words were fine. Their words were really clean. They didn't curse at you. They didn't yell at you. They didn't anything. But, I mean, yelling is still tone. But tone policing people is doesn't work well. You can't just be like, the tone that you used with me really wasn't okay. And by the way, this goes back to this thing about I versus you. If you say the tone that you used made me feel worthless, for example, and there's nothing wrong with saying something like that, the onus becomes on the act and not the person, almost. And I think that that's an important thing to sort of push forward in your communication. And the last one, and this is something which I think everybody could observe better, me included, is that implementation is the best apology. So rather than, if you do something and your partner like tells you that hurt them, the best thing to do is change your behavior. And changing your behavior is it's hard for a lot of people. If you have a habit or something, you interrupt people, it's hard to stop interrupting people. That's something I'm working on right now, because I come from a very sort of shoot at the hip, get your words in edgewise kind of house. And the implementation matters more than the apology. You can have the most sincere and heartfelt apology, but if you don't implement, nobody cares. It doesn't matter. You might as well have just not apologized. So these are all ideas we're going to be hopefully talking about more. And if you want to hear more of this kind of thing, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. And yeah, if not, I hope these things were useful to you anyway. And yeah, give me some feedback in the comments. Let me know how I did. All right, guys, have a good weekend. Bye.